My name is Rashied Omar, and I am a teaching professor of Islamic Studies and Peacebuilding here at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which forms part of the Keough School of Global Affairs based at the University of Notre in Indiana, USA. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to this virtual online flash panel titled "The Chaos in Sudan, Democracy versus Militarization." It is my privilege and my honor to introduce you to our host and facilitator for this online flash panel discussion. I want to introduce you to my good friend and colleague, Professor Ebrahim Moosa. Ebrahim Moosa is the Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies here at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Moosa also co-directs Contending Modernities, the global research and education initiative examining the interaction among Catholic, Muslim, and other religious and secular forces in the world. Last but not least, Ebrahim is also a member of PAMOJA. PAMOJA is the University of Notre Dame's research initiative for Africa. Once again, it is my great pleasure to bid you a warm welcome to all of our online participants. And it gives me pleasure to now hand you over to our host and facilitator for this flash panel discussion, Professor Ebrahim Moosa. Over to you, Ebrahim.
Thank you so much, Professor Omar, and thank you for urging me and others to host this panel. And you have deep connections to Sudan, as do I, with friends and that are part of the Sudan. And the current crisis today deserves the world's attention. And this flash panel is intended to create awareness of these developments inside Sudan. As a number of us on this panel today are involved in peace studies, the goal is to inform and alert a global public about the need to create conditions of stability, safety, and ultimately peace and prosperity in the Sudan. To help us explore the current crisis and the topic at hand, I'm honored by a panel of 4 speakers and experts who are knowledgeable about developments in the Sudan, who have joined us, and I'll introduce them briefly. Regrettably, a journalist working on the ground, Ismail Khushkhush from Khartoum, cannot join us. He's in the train from Aswan to Cairo, but he would have also shared his insights. We can't have him here today. As you know, Sudan has a 62 years post-independence and a very long history. And there can be a lot of blame being spread amongst the various actors. Accountability will be important. But for right now, we want to do 3 things in this conversation. One is to analyze the current situation. And we want our speakers to shed light on what is transpiring. Number 2, what are the possible ways that our panelists think that we can end the current conflict right now to end the bloodshed? And 3, then ask them to think about the way forward. Before I introduce my speakers, I want to thank Josh Lupo, Danya Strahan, and Ariane Woodworth for their support in organizing today's panel. But more importantly, we want participants who are participating through Zoom, or those of you on YouTube live stream, that you should submit your questions in the chat, and we look forward to address your questions. Our 4 speakers are Ms. Dina Badri, who is a Ph.D. candidate in public health at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. She has an intimate connection to the Kroc Institute because she did a master's in international peace studies at the University of Notre Dame in 2001. and she has a master's in health management from Birmingham University in the UK. We are very fortunate also to have Ms. Nasreen Malik. Ms. Nasreen Malik is a columnist and a features writer for The Guardian and the author of We Need New Stories, Challenging the Toxic Myths Behind Our Age of Discontent. And her work, focuses on politics and global movements for social inclusion. Our third speaker is Professor Abdelwahab El-Affendi, President and Provost of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, previously coordinator of the Democracy and Islam program at the University of Westminster. As some of you would know, Professor Abdelwahab, he was also once a pilot, but he and we met many years ago when he was a journalist and magazine editor in the United Kingdom. And lastly, we have Ms. Jacqueline Burns. Jackie Burns is a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. She's also a Ph.D. student in political science at the University of California, Irvine, and recently had an op-ed piece in the publication, the New York Times. So thank you very much for taking time out to join me here today. First question I want to pose to Ms. Dina Badri. We are 15 days into the conflict with a growing death toll. There's internal migration happening. People are fleeing. International communities have basically asked their citizens to leave, and there have been flights leaving out of Sudan, and there have been several fragile ceasefires. But what we first want to know, if you can shed light on what you are learning from friends and family about life in the various cities of Sudan in the last 15 days, and what are the conditions on the ground? Over to you, Ms. Badri.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Can everybody see me? Because my video is not, the host is not allowing me to open the video for some reason. I don't know. Okay. Okay, there you go. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this flash panel regarding the crisis in Khartoum. I would like to read first a few words or sentences from my presentation. And before I begin, I would like to, if you allow me, to pay tribute to all the Sudanese lives lost in this conflict and previous ones. I was in Khartoum 6 weeks ago, and fortunately or unfortunately, I missed it. I come to you today as a very saddened Sudanese, saddened by the death of Sudan, the death of its resources, River Nile, and recently the death of my beloved nephew, Dr. Bushra, Sudanese American graduate of Iowa, who was stabbed in front of his house in Khartoum a few days ago, as well as the death of hundreds of fellow Sudanese men, women, and children. I have been asked today to share with you the humanitarian situation in Khartoum. However, if you allow me to give a brief context of the political situation in Khartoum. I believe that the DNA of the Sudanese military has always been and seemed to give them the right to rule Sudan since independence in 1956, with only a handful of democratic elected or transitional governments. The existence today of two armies in any one country is a calling for war. The tactics used by the current warring factions in the form of demolishing Khartoum and the eradication of its citizens grants this war more leverage to continue. General Al-Burhan, head of Sudan Armed Forces, and Hemeti, head of the Janjaweed militia, today known as the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, were both part of Sudan's previous totalitarian NIF regime, headed by Omar al-Bashir. Hemeti and his militia were created in 2013, actually, as a means to protect al-Bashir when al-Bashir felt that he was threatened by a possibility of an internal coup against him. He even named Hemeti as Himaiti, which in Arabic means my protection. Further, both Al-Burhan and Hemeti took part in the Darfur conflicts. It is noteworthy to mention that a large part of the soldiers in Hemeti's group, the RSF, are originally from Chad. Some of them are from Chad, some of them are from Sudan, and are less than 18 years of age, which brings in the phenomena of the use of child soldiers in this conflict. Democracy in Sudan was never given enough time and space to flourish, to fail, and to be amended along the way. It was regularly and abruptly seized by army officials, either with or without the aid of political parties. Sudanese narratives have proven this. For example, in '69, the Nimeri regime lasted 16 years, and in '89, the Bashir regime lasted 30 years, phenomena which is not atypical in much of the African continent. Recently, in 2022, the agreement framework drafted by Sudanese political activists and lawyers paved the way towards a democratic transition period leading to free elections. The framework was willingly signed by both Hemeti and Burhan. However, one of the most important aspects of this framework was to endorse the RSF, which is headed by Hemeti, and other small armed forces belonging to factions of the political front into the Sudanese mainstream army. But before the completion of this process, leading to a democracy in Khartoum, the war broke out on the 15th of April, with both warring factions, Hemeti's and Burhan's factions, blaming each other for its initiation. I move on to the humanitarian crisis now. The RSF Janjaweed, or militia, and the military are shooting each other. The RSF are using Khartoum civilians as human shields. They are seizing their homes and some hospitals as places to hide in and complete their attacks, leading to hundreds of innocent people being killed and wounded. Corpses are left on the ground to rot instead of being buried in dignity. Tankers and airplane strikes on all of Khartoum, bombing and burning of main buildings like commercial buildings, banks, shops, hospitals, and pharmacies. There is also random looting of homes and factories and shops in search of money and food, etc., mainly by the RSF militia. There is also the destruction of roads and cars, and telecommunications and internet services are interrupted. There is shutdown of also several local newspapers. There has been no electricity and water for weeks. Civilians get their water supplies with difficulty from nearby rivers. There is a severe food shortage, which will lead to a country's famine. Civilians are imprisoned in their homes, Khartoum, afraid to leave. If they do, they face the fear of death. Expats have been evacuated in these past few weeks by their respective countries through air and sea. The mayor of Khartoum is calling for people to organize themselves to protect their own homes and shops. The Sudanese Medical Association is stating that the death toll is rising to more than 500, with more than 4,000 wounded in this Khartoum crisis. Doctors and other medical personnel in Sudan and the diaspora have begun to collaborate and set up different healthcare means. They are posting on social media different messages of self-help and first aid to assist the civilians. For example, the injured, women in labor, elderly people, diabetic patients, and others with chronic illnesses. Sudanese psychologists and other counselors have also posted on social media ways to deal with fear and healing of traumatic events as a result of the ongoing bombings. Doctors have repeatedly requested for safe passages to allow injured civilians and patients to reach any operating facility, but to no avail. Some of the doctors are risking their lives by coming to homes to tend to sick people. There is severe shortage of medical supplies. As a result of the ongoing conflict, Khartoum has witnessed the uprooting of families and the fleeing of thousands of people to neighboring countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, and Chad. For the past week, I have been involved in assisting my sister and cousins to flee this deadly attack. Unfortunately, these hosting neighboring countries are ill-prepared to swiftly attend to Khartoum refugees in terms of border crossing, accommodation, or medical ambulatory services. Others have fled to Sudanese towns and cities where homes, mosques, schools, and hotels have been turned into a lodging shelter for the families coming in from Khartoum. Alongside major roads leading to outer Khartoum, tents have been set up by locals to welcome those who have fled and ease the pain of their fellow brothers and sisters. This sentiment of love and brotherhood is nothing but that of Sudanese values. Local assistance cannot be sustained in view of soaring living expenses and daily inflation rates. Thus, we call for the immediate attention and support of international humanitarian agencies to please assist with this influx of the newly created Khartoum refugees. Furthermore, Sudanese youth groups in Khartoum have begun to mobilize to carry out services like quickly transporting the wounded to any sort of health facility if available, as well as reporting and monitoring the looting and destruction of shops and homes and posting it on social media. The need for food and medical supply airdrops is needed now, alongside the call for an immediate ceasefire and the urgent stop of arming the warring factions. The plight of Khartoum after the end of this deadly conflict is unknown. It is enough, it is painful, it is unjust, and it is extremely heartbreaking what is happening in Sudan. In conclusion, I ask, aren't these militias from this same country with the same blood running in their veins? Are they not killing their own mothers, fathers, and brethren? And all this destruction and misery for what? For money? For power? Will they take it to their graves? Or do they believe they are internal? On a more positive note, I would like also to share some sentences of moving forward. I believe that nothing can unite Sudan except Sudanism, which means coming together as a unified body for peace, sovereignty, and development. Finally, it is important to understand that we are all to blame for allowing the ill-minded to rule us, for not saying no to any external or internal forces to destroy Sudan's soil, tradition, and sovereignty, or manipulate and corrupt our human values and resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Badri, for that very powerful input. And we all feel for the people of Sudan and for the personal tragedies that each one of you are experiencing. I want to call on Ms. Malik to give us her understanding of the context. We've been hearing about these ongoing fight, as Ms. Badri just pointed out. But furthermore, we've also been hearing about ceasefires that are fragile. What are you hearing as a journalist and someone located, based in London? But furthermore, going through the newspapers, the New York Times this morning, the Washington Post, and so on, one hears of the impending humanitarian crisis. Hospitals are shutting down, people are fleeing. What are we hearing, and could you shed some light on what you're hearing about the democratic forces, particularly the movement known as the Forces of Freedom and Change? What are they saying, and how are they handling or interpreting the situation? Ms. Malik, please.
Thank you. Before I start, I'd like to also extend my condolences to Ms. Dina. The death of her nephew, even though I did not know him, has resonated far and wide with the diaspora Sudanese community. So my condolences once again. I think I'd like to start in answering that question by rewinding about 20, 30 years. I think the problem with any sort of analysis of what's happening on the ground in Sudan at the moment has to be rooted in the kind of foundational problems that led to where we are today, which means that moving forward is very difficult. And I can see actually in the webinar chat questions asking exactly how did we get here? And we got here because of two histories, a short history and a long history. The short history is the one that starts with the Darfur war, where the militia, the RSF, that is the second party to the army in this conflict, was created out of the remnants of the Janjaweed, which were Arab gangs that attacked sedentary African tribes. That was a very localized conflict that the central government then didn't want to engage the army in, because the army had just spent 40, 50 years fighting against the South, and therefore used these Janjaweed Arab, very violent gangs as a proxy for the army and the military. And then they became formalized under the umbrella of the RSF, and the RSF and the army were in fact partners for decades in suppressing regional rebellion in Sudan from Darfur to other areas as well, with the intention of keeping the central government safe and fortified from the results of marginalization and frustration on the part of people who lived outside of Khartoum or who were not part of an ethnic elite that had benefited from Sudan's spoils since independence. Now, this is a short history, if you'd believe it. It's, even though it's, 20, 25 years long, then there is a longer history, which is the centralization of power in Sudan and the fact that power was always held in the hands of this very small elite, both ethnically and class-wise. And so all these conflagrations that happen in Sudan, from Darfur to South Kordofan to Blue Nile, and even in the South, which has now seceded, are related to the fact that power is too centralized both in Khartoum geographically and both within the hands of a small ethnic and kind of technocratic elite. And so this is a sort of coming home to roost, in a sense, of all of Sudan's marginalizations and suppressions, and not sharing resources equally between the center and the peripheries. And the manifestation of that is this Rapid Support Forces army that grew out of the remnants of a proxy force, and the army, which is now fighting on behalf of an elite and a ruling class that have ruled for decades and decades and are now trying to combat the results of their policies since independence, essentially. So that is as brief as I can make the background at the moment. The reason I start with this is because then it becomes very difficult to see how we come out of this impasse, because both these parties, the RSF, the military, and, to your question, the civilian forces under the auspices of the Forces for Freedom of Change, the FFC, are kind of out of road. The RSF is in a fight for its life, because if they lose this, they have nothing. The army is fighting not just for the army, but for the integrity of the Sudanese nation as we know it. And the FFC made some very serious mistakes that actually contributed to the situation where they thought that by becoming a sort of third party to intermediate between the army and the RSF, they could somehow get them to cede power, which was always unrealistic. Now, I was in Sudan as well about 6 weeks ago, and you could tell that it was incredibly tense, because this sense that everybody was running out of plausible solutions that could maintain governance without conflict, it was running out. The civilian forces were enabling the head of the RSF, Hemeti, which meant that the streets were very upset. The street protest movements were very upset because they saw Hemeti and the RSF as people who had contributed to serious suppression across the country, but also in Khartoum since 2019. They thought that the army was never going to be an institution that would ever cede power voluntarily in Sudan, and that there were also foreign forces that were enabling the army and the RFC, the RSF and the FFC, by trying to just create this sort of synthetic government that just meant that conflict didn't happen. And it was very unrealistic. And that's why it all kicked off at the moment, at the time it did, about 3 weeks ago now. Now, I'll keep it brief because I don't have 5 minutes. But in terms of what's happening on the ground right now, it is absolute chaos. No one knows what's happening. It's very unusual in conflicts of this nature that there isn't a clear idea of anybody's game plan. The civilian forces are scattered and actually never really represented a comprehensive group of civilian forces. They were always a kind of umbrella organization. They're scattered, and actually many have joined the ranks of these refugees that Ms. Dina was talking about. The RSF has, absolutely no strong relationships with parties outside of Sudan that you can depend on. Its allies are in Libya, in Russia, in the UAE. So there's very little leverage on the RSF. And the army is being, as characteristically in Sudan, uncommunicative, not reassuring, and releasing sort of lots of propaganda that people can't quite trust. So there's very little information to go on, primarily because there's just no journalism on the ground in Khartoum, which is the most important area to be in. So what we are obliged to conclude from this situation is that this is a fight to the death for these two armies that are fighting to take control of the capital. And the problem is, now I'll end on this thought, the problem is that we don't quite know at the moment the military capabilities of these two armies. This is not a civil war. It is a conflict between two military organizations, one that is within the state and one that is paramilitary and outside the state. If they are equally matched in terms of firepower, this could go on for a very, very long time until it becomes clear that they both run out and therefore need to come to the table to find some sort of resolution. Or one party, it looks like that might be the army because they have air firepower, which the RSF doesn't have, manages to overwhelm the other. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any party that is particularly dominant. So the only resolution that I can see in the short term is that one party either dominates the other in terms of military capabilities that they haven't really unrolled over the past 3 weeks, which would seem unlikely, or that there are reinforcements from foreign parties. And I take no view on who this, which of these parties should win. They both have allies. They both have military capabilities that can be extended to them from abroad. And if neither of them get a line from abroad in terms of funding or armament, they are going to continue in this slow bleed war of attrition, which is bad news for everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Malik, for that very clear and very concise background on what is happening, but is also at the same time very scary, the scenario that you draw. I want to invite Professor Abdelwahab El-Affendi, who clearly understands this issue also from a geopolitical perspective. But from what Ms. Malik just portrayed, Professor Abdelwahab, the question is that either of these two parties, if one dominates the other, this is going to happen on the bodies and the souls of Sudanese civilians and at the cost to Sudan. That's number one. And so I want to shed some light on what our previous two speakers have just shared, and if you have a perspective on the overall context of the crisis, but also if you could shed some light on the geopolitical dimension of this conflict, how it is playing out right now with the various forces in the region, and also in terms of, as Ms. Malik just pointed out, that the democratic forces are now scattered in different areas, and they're also part of the refugees. But it's quite a dangerous situation that we have right now. Professor Abdelwahab.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Our hearts, of course, and thoughts go to our families and friends in Sudan and Khartoum in particular, who are under really intense and impossible pressures. I find myself as a minority with three brilliant and very eloquent women, ladies, and so I don't know if I can say much of good, but what I hope is that what we say here should benefit the people who are in Sudan on the ground at the moment. And I would like to make two short points. The first one is about the origin of this conflict, and I always try to look at the approximate causes. I wrote a book on Darfur in Arabic many years ago, in which I said people speak about environmental causes and about tribal competition, about scarce resources, about government, but in the end, the conflict in Darfur erupted in 2003 because of choices made by actors in the government of Sudan, the SPLM at that time, and some politicians and intellectuals and actors in Darfur and elsewhere. I think the same can be said about what's happening in Sudan today. I think it mainly goes to the mismanagement of the supposedly democratic transition. I've made myself very unpopular at the beginning of the transition period with some of my friends in the government, including Hamdok and the finance minister, Dr. Ebrahim al-Badawi, by pointing out that the way the transition has been structured is going to lead to trouble, because the transition has been based not in, as happened, for example, in 1985, around a consensus on a largely neutral government with inclusiveness of all the main actors, and with a focus on moving towards democracy in the easiest and the shortest way, as also happened in October 1964 as well. The transition was based on some ideas of excluding big chunks of the population, on ideological parties like the Ba'ath Party and the Communist Party, which were not that much of Democrats. And I said several times, because I write columns in the newspapers, that if you want to engage in inclusion, you need to rely on military support to do this. You cannot send the professional association to arrest your enemies, and you cannot imprison them at the lawyer's headquarters. So you are going to rely either on the military or on the militias. And at that time, actually, the FFC forces, the FCC forces, they have made a dual alliance with the military and the militia. In this more recent deal, they decided actually to have the deal with the militia rather than the army, hoping that during the transition period they would be able to dismantle the army, and hoping that then the FFCC, the RSF would be very happy to hand them power then at that time. That was, I think, a lot of wishful thinking. But anyway, the root of the cause is that the polarization among the civilians in Sudan has actually increased during the last 4 years, which since the fall of al-Bashir. We had the main Freedom and Change group, which is now a splinter of that coalition. Many big factions of it have now left. And we have also witnessed what I call also outbidding in extremism. There's the Freedom and Change forces were at one point the radical group. Now they are seen as sellouts by groups which are more radical. So this is, I think, the cause of the problem. I have been calling all the time for a consensus among the civilian actors and the pro-democracy groups to leave this fragmentation and this outbidding for extremism, and try to not rely on any of the military, or I think to isolate actually both military factions by having a broader popular civilian coalition. This, the direction, the people have been moving in the in the opposite direction. The other important point, I think, which I would like to say is that what we have witnessed in the last 2 weeks was a very interesting disappearance of the state. And usually when this happens, you realize what important the state is. Because of the fighting in Khartoum, and that the military is focused on fighting rather than on keeping law and order, most people have been unable to leave their homes. And this includes not only doctors and other important workers, but also the police. So we have now a state of lawlessness, which is unprecedented. People are looting everything, and the state just is not there, and the people are left to fend for themselves. So I think this is really an interesting, for us political scientists, study of what the state does and what happens when it's not there. But of course, not only I think that people are bleeding and dying on the streets, or some of them almost dying of starvation. The state itself is actually now on its deathbed. If this conflict goes on for more time, it will be very difficult for us now to bring the state back in. We have seen what happened in Somalia and other places like Libya, where once the state collapses, it's very difficult to get it back in track. So I hope that the international community does not go to its usual traditional, let's say, obfuscation of saying that there are two parties here, let's bring them to the table and let them talk. I think they should realize that there's something wrong there. And the international community, if they want to go in, they should go in to restore the state at the first thing, and bring peace to Khartoum, at least by negotiation or otherwise. And we shouldn't, we cannot advocate going to the status quo ante, where there's a militia which is occupying every part of Khartoum, including inside the military centers, and the way also there's a fragmented peace or civilian scene. They should be, as I said in one of my recent articles, we should try and bring in a civilian government which is not actually formed by let's say what you call muhasasa, or people trying to get each group getting its share. People should get a civilian government of upright people who are respected widely and also are efficient. I think what problem we had with the freedom and change people during the last 4 years is that they were grossly incompetent, whatever their good intention or bad intentions, and a lot of them have many bad intentions, but they were incompetent even at doing evil things. So we need people who are competent, who are impartial to a certain degree, and who should be able to bring the country on a route towards a democratic transition in a peaceful way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdelwahab. So your main call has been that the next step should be the resuscitation of the state. And for the three Sudanese panelists, before I move on to Ms. Burns, Jacqueline Burns, in the next round of questions, I want you to think about the situation and some of the questioners have asked this question. Who does the Sudanese people trust more, the army or the paramilitary forces? That's something to think about, especially since the paramilitary forces and the army have now both enjoyed some kind of legitimacy by recognition through this transitional government. So there's something to think about. I want to call on Ms. Jacqueline Burns especially in the light of what Professor Abdelwahab talked about, this whole question of the international community. Do you have, since you've been involved in advising a former US envoy on the Sudan issue, Ms. Burns, is there anything in your mind of what the UN, the international community, the African Union can do or ought to do based on previous US attempts to try to mediate? What are your thoughts on this issue, Ms. Burns?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on this panel today. My heart and thoughts are with the Sudanese people in this absolutely heartbreaking time. As you noted, I was a negotiations advisor to the U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan from 2011 to 2017, and I was deeply involved in the AU and UN-led negotiations to end the conflicts in Darfur and the two areas of Sudan. My research now focuses on inclusive peace processes and bottom-up peace formation efforts, which is a product of my time in Sudan and the failures I saw within the internationally led processes there. The UN, along with the AU, the US, the UK, and a bunch of other actors have, in the immediate term, been working to get the parties to agree to and abide by a longer-term cessation of hostilities and return to negotiations for a civilian-led transition. But unfortunately, the last 2 decades of international interventions in Sudan have left a legacy of legitimizing the armed actors and prioritizing their demands at the expense of civilian actors, to include women who are largely responsible for the popular uprising in 2019. And this is despite the fact that we've had every indication that the armed groups in Sudan were never truly interested in peace, but only in their own political futures. These dynamics got worse following the military coup of 2021, when the two military leaders are fighting now, Hemeti and Ebrahim, joined together to overthrow the civilian transition, because despite condemnation of the coup, the international community continued to treat these two military men as the de facto political leaders. And all the while, regional and international actors such as Wagner Group, Russia, Egypt, and some of the Gulf states were picking sides and providing support and assurances to Hemeti and Ebrahim. So it's not surprising that the leaders felt emboldened to bring their power struggle to the streets. In my opinion, if we want to break the cycle of militarized violence in Sudan, future interventions need to prioritize inclusivity, much as our last distinguished panelists noted. Looking forward, I think international partners engaging in Sudan need to move away from the one-size-fits-all approach to peace processes, in which we expect armed actors to sit down, make concessions, and sign formal agreements, with often minimal participation from a diverse set of civilian stakeholders. From my own experience in the processes, I can tell you that it's easy as a negotiator to get drawn into a sort of path dependency, to start accepting that maybe this is the best we can do, and that maybe if we find the right levers to get just enough concessions, the fighting will stop for long enough for that political reforms will start to follow. But the problem is, by continuing to prioritize the voices of these armed actors in the peace processes, we legitimize them, both within and outside of Sudan, and embolden them to believe that their demands would continue to be prioritized. Further, these agreements, these final agreements, may be premature. As we heard from other panelists, the Sudanese people have not had time to build consensus around what they want the future of their country to look like. Civilians can have incredible power, as we saw in the popular uprising of 2019 that led to Bashir's ouster. Unfortunately, the peace processes in Sudan have inadvertently undercut the power of civilians in this single-minded drive to reach short-term agreements. And this push for signed agreements also increased tensions among the armed actors, leading to this current violence in Sudan. And now, of course, these dynamics are not entirely the fault of the international community, and there are many challenges to shifting them. For one, while I definitely do not advocate for prioritizing the demands of the armed actors, as I've noted, given the current scale of the violence and the strength of both fighting forces, we do need a long-term cessation of hostilities to give space for any civilian-led inclusive process to take place. But in order to get Hemeti and Ebrahim to stop fighting, they both need to feel like their own survival is not at stake. We heard that they are both fighting for their lives, and particularly Hemeti and the RSF. There's quite a bit of literature out there looking at military integration during transitions and following internal conflict. And one finding is that if armed movements, and particularly ones with significant strength, feel like their survival is at stake, a return to civil war is more likely, which is exactly what we've seen in Sudan, where Hemeti felt threatened by the proposed sheer integration into the Sunnis' armed forces. But realistically, getting Ebrahim to agree to more extended or open-ended integration of the RSF will be difficult. And it may also be difficult for some to accept given the horrendous track record of Hemeti and the RSF. But I do think there are examples where taking the pressure off of getting to final agreements and signed agreements and final arrangements allows the space and the breathing room for more organic civilian-led processes. And such processes in turn can build consensus among civilian actors and help hold armed actors accountable. Numerous times since 2019 have we seen civilian-led movements in Sudan put pressure on armed actors to change their behavior. But the international community also needs to prioritize these movements and give the Sudanese people support and time to build this internal consensus and momentum towards more representative governance, rather than focusing on these elite-centered arrangements. So I'll just close by saying that this is not easy. This is incredibly complex. But if the international community does not find ways to support more inclusive processes and prioritize the actors fighting for peace, not power, I think we can only expect to see more of the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack, Ms. Burns, for your input there. So what I'm hearing is that we're either heading for a stalemate and a Somalia kind of situation, or a Libya kind of situation, which is horrendous and dangerous to everybody involved. I'm also hearing that the international community, if there is going to be any kind of intervention, must give priority, as you pointed out, to the democratically centered actors. Now, there has been a complaint that they are not too competent. It's clearly now that there are armed forces, and this is not the first time in the world that we've seen that paramilitary forces have to be integrated, required to be integrated into existing armies. These are very, very difficult tasks, oftentimes not entirely successful, but it seems that's about the only thing that will bring down a cessation of hostilities that is now taking place at the cost of Sudanese lives. That's the one thing. And the second thing is to bring some responsible people into governance. Do any of our speakers have any further thoughts on the conversation that we had just now as a second round of comments that you might have? Can I call upon Dina Badri or Ms. Nasrin Malik?
Yeah, I'd like to say something
Yes.
very briefly. Can everyone see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Great. So on this point of integrating the RSF into the military, which was the thing that I think hastened this scenario, because it was disagreement about how the RSF would be integrated into the army and when, and Hemeti's position. I think the time has passed for that now. I think it's I find it difficult to see how these two men can be brought back to the negotiating table. Trust has completely evaporated. There has been extremely inflammatory language. Hemeti called Burhan a traitor and a criminal and said that he will either be brought to justice or killed like a dog. Burhan has, called Hemeti a rebel. There have been actions on the ground of such severe violence, looting, assault, and wanton aggression that means that it would be very difficult for the army to think of the RSF as in any viable fashion as a reliable partner. And the view will be that, any time that there is disagreement, this will fall apart again. So I think there was a time where that was a viable scenario, but I think that time is gone. Not to sound like a doom monger, I'd be very happily surprised if that was the case. And in that sense, I find that the conversation around any leverage Western powers has slightly unrealistic, because Western powers never had that much leverage in Sudan in the first place for a bunch of reasons. One of them is that Western powers shunned and isolated Sudan for so long that links to the global community became very weak. And so there was sort of very little that Western powers had in Sudan that they could wield over them. And second of all, these two parties, particularly Hemeti, do not care. And the coup is evidence of that. You know, the time the coup happened, Sudan was on a fruitful path. You know, we had debt relief, we had the IMF on the World Bank online, we'd been taken off the state sponsors of terror list, we'd begun to reintegrate into the national community, and there was really quite a bright future ahead. But these two characters do not care, because all they care about is, somebody I think said earlier, a very resonant phrase, which is they don't care if Sudan turns into dust as long as they're the ones controlling that dust. And this is about power, and this is about the very limited resources within Sudan that, if they are controlled and monopolized by one party, can be quite lucrative. You know, if Hemeti runs simply gold exports in Sudan, he will be a billionaire for life and be able to run Sudan based on those resources. So one of the difficulties, I'll end on this thought, one of the difficulties of the situation in Sudan is the lack of leverage and the lack of motivation these two partners have to listen to anyone, because there is no scenario that they fear more than being ejected out of power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to remind our audience that you can post questions, and we look forward to your questions. So I want to also ask this question about these geopolitical situations, not only the Western powers, but also Saudi Arabia and the UAE that has some leverage over the actors inside Sudan. And also there's a very large Sudanese community in exile. Are there any thoughts or initiatives at those two levels, and whether good or bad, what they can do, and in facilitating this, if there's so much mistrust, as I'm also hearing, that the international community do things in terms of their agenda? Professor Abdelwahab or Dina Badri or Jackie, any one of you have any ideas?
I'd like, hello, yes. I'd like to, can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, I wanted to actually, in response to that question, but really, I was reading the messages here, and it says that, first of all, I wanted to respond to one of the people who posted a message on the web chat, and it said, the question was, who do the Sudanese people trust? And well, first of all, the Sudanese people don't trust either the military or obviously the RSF for a number of reasons, and one of them is this ongoing conflict. But I wanted to draw attention that Sudan has a population of, and the population of Sudan, 60% of it are youth. And these youth groups have been involved in the past 4 years, both boys and girls, or male and female, in sort of paving a way for a democracy. And their aspirations and their dreams for Sudan is, well, one of their slogans is, all of these past 4 years, is freedom, peace, and justice. And within that slogan, within that framework, they did a lot of programs in terms of for the people and for them within themselves to pave this way for democracy. And for example, there was during the sit-ins in 2019, after the takedown of al-Bashir's regime, they kind of created a new Sudan. And they always chanted that we will build Sudan, a Sudan that we dreamed of. And they sang songs, and they did poems, and cleaned the streets, and they even created a sort of mini banking system where people would kind of donate what they have in terms of money, and to help those people who don't have money. And it was really it was like a sight for sore eyes to see. And it was documented all around the world. And after this conflict that started, and even before that, you can see that there's been a crushing of the dreams of these youth. And in response to what Ms. Jacqueline was saying, civil society and civil actors, I believe that the inclusion of new actors in the political front and mediation process and so on is essential and is needed. Hopefully, as soon as this conflict finishes, or when it finishes, we don't know, of course, but the inclusion of new actors and even the mothers of martyrs, the martyrs of war, the mothers who lost their sons and daughters in these past 4 years. Hundreds have died, and their voices need to be included and in moving forward, Yani. And another thing is because these people have really bear the grunt of the war and the conflict, and like the other distinguished speakers said, that there seems to be no platform where these two military warmongers will come and reach some kind of agreement, or see that there is a need to stop the war, especially that if there are external forces who are continuing to arm them, whether Hemeti or Burhan. So, and it is really like, it's my right to be the leader and it's my right to be the ruler. And in all of this nonsense and sadness, it is the civilians who are carrying this burden, whether it is death or whether it is losing their limbs or their eyes. It is so extremely tragic what has happened in these past 4 years, because I mean the riots never stopped. I mean, it has been documented all over the media. The riots never stopped, even when there was the signing of this framework, the framework in 2022, like I mentioned earlier, which is where all the political parties came together, and Hemeti and Burhan were also part of this. But there was no really, the political parties were on one side pushing forward this agreement for a free election and a democratic transition. And you can see, there wasn't any commitment or trust from either the military or the RSF, Hemeti's group. And this mistrust and this creates all this antagonism and just demolishes any kind of going forward. So I believe, I've touched on a few points here, but I believe that it is high time for all of this to stop, and because, like I said, this is not just this conflict in Khartoum that has started two weeks ago. This conflict is like the culmination of what has been happening these 4 years during the transitional government, and particularly after the coup in the 25th of October, which I was there in 2021. I remember I was there, and I went out when there was the riots that took, denouncing this coup, which was on the 30th of October. And there were millions of people who were so upset and so sad because, this coup just came out of nowhere, well, it came out of somewhere, obviously, but it was really like a break in Hamdok's government, the previous Prime Minister Hamdok, where I believe him and his interim government, for first and foremost, they took Sudan out of the terrorist list, and certain economic bans were lifted from Sudan, which has been placed in Sudan, and Sudan was left out of the world for 3 decades. So even in this very small period, this transitional government managed to do things. Of course, there are faults and there were problems that they have been faced with, but there were some kind of positive elements and significant ones during their transitional rule. And so moving forward, I think that there needs to be a change of sort of actors in this in the political arena. I've mentioned the mothers of the martyrs and the youth groups. We can't just keep on continuing with the same political parties, and even these political parties which are in the scene in Sudan, they themselves have their own mini militias and armed groups. Like, for example, what's his name? The previous Minister of Finance, Jibril. They all now, these political parties who have their own militias or armed groups, they all work under, they're all under the umbrella of the Sudanese Democratic Front.
Yes.
Which
so it seems that what you're suggesting is that there should be a cessation of hostilities at all levels. We are running out of time. We are basically at the end of our time. I just wanted to thank you so much. I just wanted to invite Professor Abdelwahab in the last couple of seconds, whether you had any suggestions that if the international community be mistrusted, there are regional actors involved. Do you think that there's any kind of possibility that they can be positive agents for change? Because it seems that situation looks fairly grim. Sudanese are normally deemed to be reasonable people. Why can't reasonable Sudanese begin to address the question that they are faced with and minimize the level of violence? Any thoughts? Last minute.
Yes, I think there are many initiatives within Sudan itself taking place at the moment. Us also, as you mentioned earlier, the expatriates, we here in Doha are speaking to people around the world, trying to build up some ideas about way forward. I think the international community, some people say they are the cause of the problem. I wouldn't go that far, but I think there is a lot of naivety and also a lot of territoriality where this country or that union, African Union or the Arab League or the UN, each part want to build its territory. That creates problem. But in the end, I think we should, as I said, try to think of realistic solutions. I think as quite a few people, Nasreen, I think said rightly, the return to the status quo ante is not an option. And also the integration of the militia in the military is going to be more problematic now. So I hope that the international actors, especially the African Union and the IGAD, should not go to the old way of saying, let's sit down and have a negotiation. They should come up with a plan. They should come up with a plan which is realistic, but also which is sound in the sense that you cannot say this militia can be part of the scene anymore. But how you could ease it out, that should be
Can I push you? How do you think Sudanese are going to accept or be open to a plan that comes from outside? I mean, what would the elements of that plan look like? Just maybe one or two elements. If you can't go back
as I said, I think the support, the return of the state is the key thing. I think a lot of people in Sudan at the moment are seeing how the consequences of complete insecurity. They would welcome any idea which will bring them security.
So are you imagining an external force coming in and establishing security?
Not an external force, but at least a proposal which would bring the state. I think, for example, the minimum could be done is for the militia to be removed from Khartoum. There should be no presence for the militia in Khartoum anymore. The way now Khartoum is a standstill because the militia is causing complete insecurity. They are engaged in criminality, but also driving people out of their homes, and nobody's safe. So the minimum that could be done is an initiative which say, let the militia get out of Khartoum, let the state apparatuses start working, the police, the health service, the bureaucracy, the banks, And that would be a good start.
Thank you very much to all four our speakers, Ms. Jacqueline Burns, Professor Abdelwahab, Ms. Nasrin Malik, and Ms. Dina Badri, and all you who have been listening to this very, very important issue in the world, on the African continent in particular. And we are all holding out hope that today's conversation created informed people about the situation, and that at various levels we can urge our governments to be supportive of the Sudanese people and to move forward to solutions that will bring stability. And it seems from one of my takeaways from here has been that the return to some kind of stability, whether it be through a proposal or getting the paramilitary forces out of Khartoum, hopefully that they don't get stronger elsewhere. But it seems that something must be done in order to return security. I hope that the Sudanese people themselves are learning lessons from what happened in Libya and in Somalia and elsewhere, that their country don't get plunged into the crisis that other countries have been. And we are all holding up hope, and our hearts go out to the people of Sudan and to the victims of this round of violence and all that. Thank you very much, all of you, for your participation. And I hope we will have a good opportunity to talk about this again in the future. Thank you very much. From me, Ibrahim Moosa, and the Kroc Institute, we thank you all for your participation.